Part 1. The Whispering Trail. The Appalachian Trail stretched endlessly before them, a winding path of roots, rocks, and shadows. Emma and her brother, Ben, had decided to take a 3-day hike through the remote section of the trail near Blood Mountain. The name itself sent a shiver down Emma's spine, but Ben, ever the adventurer, laughed it off. "It's just a name," he said as they set up camp on their first night. The forest around them was eerily silent, save for the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. Emma felt uneasy, as if the woods were watching them. She didn't want to admit it to Ben, but something felt wrong, off in a way she couldn't explain. As the sun set and the shadows deepened, the quiet became oppressive. Even the usual nighttime symphony of crickets and owls seemed absent. They built a fire, its flickering light casting long, twisting shapes on the surrounding trees. "Do you hear that?" Emma asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ben stopped chewing on his granola bar and frowned. "Hear what?" Emma strained her ears, and there it was again, a faint rhythmic whisper, like the murmur of distant voices. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. "Probably just the wind," Ben said, though his tone was less confident now. Emma shook her head. "No, it's not the wind." They both sat in tense silence, listening. The whispers grew louder, still unintelligible but undeniably human-like. It was as if a crowd of people were murmuring just out of sight, hidden behind the dense thickets. "I don't like this," Emma muttered, pulling her jacket tighter around herself. Ben stood up, grabbed his flashlight, and shone it into the woods. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing only trees and more trees. "There's nothing out there," he said, though his hand trembled slightly. Suddenly, the whispers stopped. The silence that followed was even more unnerving, heavy and unnatural. And then came the laughter. It started as a single chuckle, low and guttural, before multiplying into dozens of overlapping cackles. The sound echoed through the forest, bouncing off the trees, making it impossible to tell where it was coming from. "Ben!" Emma's voice quivered. "Stay here," Ben said, his flashlight shaking as he stepped away from the fire. "No, don't go out there." Emma grabbed his arm, but he shook her off. "I'll just look around the camp. It's probably a group of hikers messing with us." Emma watched helplessly as Ben disappeared into the shadows, the beam of his flashlight bobbing with his steps. The laughter seemed to follow him, growing fainter as he moved farther away. And then it stopped again. The silence stretched on, suffocating and oppressive. Emma hugged her knees to her chest, her eyes fixed on the dark woods where Ben had vanished. Minutes passed, or was it hours? Emma couldn't tell anymore. The fire crackled softly, the only sound in an otherwise dead forest. "Ben!" she called out, her voice trembling. No answer. Her stomach twisted in fear. She reached for the flashlight, her hand shaking so badly she almost dropped it. Taking a deep breath, she pointed it toward the trees. "Ben!" she shouted, louder this time. Still nothing. And then, just as she was about to scream his name again, a figure stepped into the edge of the firelight. It was Ben, but something was wrong. He stood motionless, his face pale, his eyes wide and blank. His clothes were torn and his hands hung limply at his sides. "Ben?" Emma whispered, rising slowly to her feet. He didn't respond. "Are you okay? What happened?" Ben's lips parted, but the voice that came out wasn't his. "You shouldn't have come here." The fire flickered violently, and the laughter returned, louder and closer than ever. To be continued. Part 2. The Marked Path. Emma froze as the words left Ben's mouth, his voice twisted and distorted, layered with something inhuman. Her heart pounded as she stepped back, clutching the flashlight like a weapon. "Ben, what's wrong with you?" she stammered. He tilted his head, his blank eyes fixing on her. "Leave before the trail takes you too." The The fire sputtered, the shadows around the campsite elongating unnaturally. Emma's breath came in short gasps as Ben suddenly collapsed to his knees, clutching his head and groaning. "Ben!" Emma cried, rushing to him. Before she could touch him, he flinched away, looking up at her with wild, terrified eyes. "We need to leave. Now," he whispered hoarsely. "What happened? Who was laughing? What did you see?" she demanded. Ben shook his head violently. I don't know. There were people, shadows. They whispered things, horrible things. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. It's this place, Emma. We're not safe here." The laughter returned, faint and distant, as if mocking them. Emma's gaze darted to the woods, where the trees seemed to close in, their twisted branches reaching toward the campsite like grasping hands. "Okay," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "We'll pack up and go, but which way?" Ben pointed shakily toward the trail. "Back the way we came. We can't stay here." They scrambled to gather their things, their movements frantic. The fire dimmed as if the forest itself were suffocating it. The oppressive whispers grew louder, interspersed with that haunting laughter. As they hurried back onto the trail, Emma glanced over her shoulder. The campsite was gone, swallowed by the darkness. She tightened her grip on Ben's arm, her flashlight cutting through the murkiness ahead. The trail seemed unfamiliar now, even though they had followed it just hours earlier. The trees loomed closer, their gnarled trunks carved with strange, faintly glowing symbols that hadn't been there before. "Did you see these earlier?" Emma asked, pointing to the markings. Ben shook his head. "No, keep moving." The further they walked, the more the forest seemed to shift around them. The path twisted and turned in ways it hadn't before, leading them deeper into the woods instead of toward the trailhead. "It's like we're going in circles," Emma said, panic rising in her voice. Ben stopped abruptly, shining his flashlight on the ground. The beam illuminated a fresh set of footprints, large and deep, as if someone had been dragging something heavy. "Those aren't ours," Ben muttered, his face pale. Emma's flashlight flickered, and in that brief moment of darkness, the whispers surged around them. Shapes moved at the edges of the beam when the light returned, tall, thin figures with glowing eyes, just out of reach. "Run," Ben said through gritted teeth. They sprinted down the trail, their breaths ragged, the forest seeming to close in tighter with every step. The laughter followed them, growing louder and more maniacal. Suddenly, the ground beneath Emma's feet gave way. She screamed as she tumbled down a steep incline, her flashlight flying from her hand and smashing against a rock. "Emma!" Ben shouted, scrambling after her. She landed hard at the bottom, her body aching but otherwise unhurt. The forest here was darker, colder. The air felt heavy, and the glowing symbols were everywhere, etched into the trees, the rocks, even the ground itself. Ben slid down beside her, panting. "Are you okay?" Emma nodded, wincing as she stood. "What is this place?" Before Ben could answer, a low growl rumbled through the air. They turned slowly, their eyes widening in terror as a figure emerged from the shadows. It was humanoid but grotesque, its limbs unnaturally long and its face obscured by a tattered hood. Its eyes glowed an eerie white, and its mouth opened in a wide, unnatural grin, revealing jagged teeth. "You ignored the warnings," it hissed, its voice a blend of whispers and growls. Emma and Ben backed away, their breaths frozen in their throats. The creature raised a clawed hand, pointing at them with skeletal fingers. "The trail is ours. You belong to us now." The forest erupted in chaos, the laughter, the whispers, the growls blending into a cacophony of terror. Shapes moved in the shadows, and the glowing symbols began to pulse like beating hearts. "Run!" Ben shouted, grabbing Emma's arm. They bolted into the darkness, the creature's guttural laughter echoing behind them. To be continued. Part 3. The final ascent. Emma and Ben ran blindly through the shadowed woods, the whispers and laughter pursuing them like a living storm. The trail was unrecognizable now, twisting and looping impossibly, leading them deeper into the forest instead of out. "We can't keep running forever," Emma gasped, her legs burning with exhaustion. Ben glanced over his shoulder, his face pale with fear. "We don't have a choice." Ahead, the trees thinned, revealing a steep, rocky incline. At the top, a faint light glowed, a flickering beacon in the oppressive darkness. "There," Ben shouted, pointing. "It might be the way out." They scrambled up the incline, clawing at rocks and roots to pull themselves higher. The glowing symbols etched into the ground seemed to pulse faster, their light intensifying with each step. Behind them, the guttural growls grew louder, joined by the sound of snapping branches and heavy footsteps. The creature was gaining on them. Emma's hand slipped on a loose rock, and she cried out as she nearly lost her footing. Ben grabbed her wrist, hauling her up with a strength born of desperation. "Come on," he urged, dragging her the rest of the way to the summit. At the top, they found themselves on a flat, barren plateau. In the center stood an ancient stone altar, weathered by time and covered in the same glowing symbols. Surrounding it was a circle of jagged rocks, each one carved with runes that pulsed like a heartbeat. The light they had seen came from the altar itself, a faint, otherworldly glow emanating from its surface. "This doesn't look like a way out," Emma whispered, dread settling in her stomach. "It's the only place they haven't reached yet," Ben said, turning to face the incline. The creature emerged from the shadows below, its glowing eyes fixed on them. Behind it, more figures appeared. Tall, thin shapes with skeletal limbs and hollow faces, their eyes burning like embers. "We're surrounded," Emma said, her voice trembling. Ben looked at the altar, then at Emma. "This place, it's part of their world. Maybe we can use it against them." Emma hesitated. "How? What if it's a trap?" "We don't have time to argue," Ben shouted, stepping toward the altar. The creatures began to climb the incline, their movements jerky and unnatural. The guttural laughter grew louder, reverberating through the night. Emma followed Ben, her eyes scanning the runes for any clue. "What are we supposed to do?" Ben reached out to touch the glowing surface of the altar. The moment his fingers made contact, the symbols flared brightly, and a deafening roar filled the air. The creatures froze, their movements halting as if paralyzed. "It's working!" Ben yelled. But the light from the altar grew blinding, and Emma felt a sudden, searing heat in her chest. She clutched at her shirt, gasping as the glowing symbols appeared on her skin, spreading like wildfire. "Emma!" Ben turned to her, his face stricken with horror. The altar's light pulsed violently, and a voice boomed through the forest, deep and ancient. "One must remain. The trail demands its keeper." Emma's knees buckled as the heat intensified, the symbols burning brighter with every pulse. She understood now. The trail wasn't just a place. It was a force, ancient and insatiable, demanding a soul to sustain its power. "No!" Ben shouted, grabbing her shoulders. "Take me instead." The voice echoed again, cold and unyielding. "The choice has been made." Emma shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "Ben, you have to go. Get out of here while you can." "I'm not leaving you," he cried, gripping her tightly. The creatures began to move again, their eyes fixed on the altar. The ground beneath them trembled, and the air grew thick with the scent of decay. "Ben, please," Emma sobbed. "I'll hold them off. You have to run." Before he could argue, the light from the altar exploded outward, knocking him back. He hit the ground hard, his vision swimming as the world around him blurred. When he looked up, Emma was standing at the altar, her body surrounded by the glowing runes. The creatures stopped their advance, bowing their heads as if in reverence. "Go," Emma said, her voice calm and steady. "Before it's too late." Ben hesitated, his heart breaking, but the forest began to close in around him, the trees twisting and shifting to block his path. "Run!" Emma shouted, her voice echoing with an otherworldly resonance. With tears streaming down his face, Ben turned and fled, the whispers and laughter fading behind him. The trail shifted beneath his feet, guiding him back to the edge of the forest. When he finally broke through the tree line, he collapsed onto the ground, gasping for air. He looked back, but the forest was silent and still, the glowing symbols and the creatures gone. Emma was gone. For the rest of his life, Ben would never forget the sound of her voice, the sight of her standing at the altar, and the promise she had made to protect him. But deep in the heart of the Appalachian Trail, the whispers continued and the symbols glowed, waiting for the next unsuspecting soul to wander too far the end.